My colleague, Melanie Holcomb, and I have been privileged over the last several years to bring to the Metropolitan Museum a number of loans of illuminated Hebrew manuscripts, both from international collections, like the one, the Lisbon's Hebrew Bible, presently on exhibition in our Medieval Europe Gallery, and on an ongoing basis from the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, and in the same gallery we have a second Hebrew Bible from their collection. It's a special joy in our nature of work to be able to study and even to handle these amazing works of art. But another wonderful benefit of the job that we have is that we get to collaborate with experts in the field. Today we have the good fortune of bringing one of them to Grace Rainey Rogers, our friend David Kraemer. Dr. Kraemer is director of the library at the Jewish Theological Seminary, where he has also served as professor of Talmud and Rabbinics for a number of years. As librarian, Professor Kraemer is at the helm of the most extensive collection of Judaica, rare and contemporary, in the Western Hemisphere. Because of the size and importance of that collection, Professor Kraemer is instrumental in setting policy and establishing vision for projects of international importance. And even though we're in the same town, I'd like to think that the loans from JTS to the Metropolitan fall under that rubric. Professor Kraemer is a prolific author and commentator. His books include The Mind of the Talmud, Responses to Suffering in Classic Rabbinic Literature, and The Meanings of Death in Rabbinic Judaism, among others. His most recent book is, on a lighter subject, Jewish Eating and Identity Through the Ages. Professor Kraemer is a popular lecturer and teacher. He was associated for many years with the National Jewish Center of Learning and Leadership, under whose auspices he lectured across the country. He's also been a teacher at the Skirball Institute for Adult Jewish Study and at the Hebrew College of Boston. Dr. Kraemer, I am pleased to report, lives in New York City. Today, he will speak to us about Hanukkah, a higher holiday. Welcome, Dr. Kraemer, please.
Okay. Is there any problem with my using both the one that's on me and these in front of me? Can you hear me okay? Yes. Okay, good. Well, let me begin by thanking Barbara and Melanie and the Met for inviting me to be here. It's really a pleasure and a privilege. We have developed both a wonderful collaboration. We, in that sentence, means the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary and the medieval European galleries and curators here at the Met over the course of the last several years, and I hope that that privilege continues. So, in any case, I'd like to focus us. This will be a visual presentation only in so much as the texts we will be studying together will be found up here on the screen. If you want to see beautiful things connected to Hanukkah, you're going to have to leave the auditorium and find your way in other directions. My job is to actually defend that title, Hanukkah, a higher holiday. I suspect if you have had anything like the kind of experiences that I've had, that is to say, if you are a person born in the United States of America or living in the United States of America in the latter half of the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, and you are familiar with Jewish observance and Jewish culture, you have probably heard it said that Hanukkah is a minor holiday. Is that fair? Hanukkah, minor holiday. Okay, well, I'm going to do my best to disabuse you of that notion, and if I succeed, you will leave here today saying to yourself, wow, I didn't realize that. So that's the path that we're going to be headed. If we go back, actually, to consider the way Hanukkah was framed for many of us, it's fair to say that, in fact, the teachers, the leaders in the Jewish community communicated both to those within the community and without that Hanukkah is actually not meant to be a Jewish Christmas, that the only reason Jews celebrate this with anything like the kind of emphasis and attention and spending that they do is because of the influence of the larger culture in which Jews in this country find themselves. And in fact, if Jews were doing Hanukkah right, they would probably do it in a relatively basic and modest way. Well, it's interesting, given that kind of lesson, that when we go back to the earlier part of the 20th century and even to the latter part of the 19th century, and consider commentators, spokespeople for the Jewish community. I've stepped out. I realize I have to be in a little bit of light here, but I hate standing behind a podium. Right? So we actually find a very different message being communicated. For those of you who are interested in following us up, I hope there's no objection to my offering a book recommendation. This book is called The Wonders of America, and it was published a number of years ago by a well-known scholar by the name of Jenna Weissman-Josselett. And Jenna pays careful attention to the material culture of Jewish life in this country, not just high material culture, beautiful material culture, but the kind of stuff that we might be tempted to call kitsch. But she interprets that kitsch as a serious expression of the life of Jews in this country, and the book is well worth reading. She does some serious work in examining the history of attitudes towards Hanukkah in this country and finds the following. I'm just going to read a little bit from her report here, but I think that you'll get the message very quickly. She writes, "For much of its history, Hanukkah fared poorly in the New World, a victim of neglect. Quote, the customary candles disappear more and more from Jewish homes, noted Dr. Gustav Gottheil, a leading Reform rabbi, as early as 1884. The same trend was ruefully confirmed several decades later by the American Jewish Chronicle, which with considerable alarm pointed to the diminishing number of Hanukkah celebrants. Quote, not even the Zionists make such a fuss about Hanukkah. The assumption here seems to be that since Hanukkah is a holiday that commemorates Jewish armies and their achievements, therefore Zionists ought to be behind this holiday. But not even the Zionists observe it. By contrast to Christmas, whose advent was energetically mapped out weeks in advance, Hanukkah's arrival was a mystery. Quote, we must ask the old man when it comes. Jews living in this country didn't even know when Hanukkah occurred. It wasn't on their calendars. To just give another, in response to this, there are a number of laments of the failure to observe the holiday. And then she quotes from a number of sources arguing that, in fact, Hanukkah ought to be observed enthusiastically. And so to give you with one example from a very prominent spokesperson, quote, kindle the Hanukkah lights anew, modern Israelites. Make the festival more than ever before radiant with the brightness and beauty of love and charity. This is from Kaufman Kohler, a very well-known leading Reform rabbi in the Jewish Messenger. He goes on and says, quote, trying the effect of the Hanukkah lights, if just for the experiment, try it. He's kind of begging for its observance. That's how neglected it was. And then Josselett goes on to point out that American Jews, that is to say, more correctly, Jews coming to this country, new immigrants, understood very well how to become good Americans. If you wanted to be an American coming to this country from Eastern Europe and you want to do it effectively, if you want to succeed in that, what do you do around this time of year? Celebrate Christmas. Right? And so it goes on, Jewish young folks give and accept Christmas presents. Christmas is an occasion for extra shopping, purchase of new clothes, going to parties and special entertainments. And this is not in the Jewish communities of the 1950s and the 1960s. The particular quotation that I just read to you comes from 1916. Okay, so this is the reality that is long since forgotten of the way Hanukkah was observed and, importantly, the way spokespeople commenting on Hanukkah emphasize that it is meant to be a holiday that is broadly observed. It is, in fact, important, and if its importance were appreciated, that we would see much more of it in the public domain. So the question I'm going to ask with you, and you already know from the title the answer that I'm going to be arguing for, is who's right? Is it the spokespeople in the early the early 20th century, the late 19th century, who were arguing for the importance of Hanukkah? Or is it those who, after the Second World War in the 50s and 60s, were afraid that Jews were celebrating Hanukkah too much like Christmas at this holiday time of year, and therefore began to argue for its lack of importance? That's what we're going to explore here. So if you will give me a chance to put down my book and come to the screen, we'll begin with the beginning. What you've got here is an important piece of the history of Hanukkah, going back, as you can see, to the book called Second Maccabees. Second Maccabees is one of 4 books called Maccabees, actually, but there are 2 primary books of Maccabees. Both of them are apocryphal works. They were not preserved as part of the Hebrew Bible, but they were preserved by churches of various sorts and, in fact, included in the official Catholic Apocrypha. And Second Maccabees, which is a work written in very close proximity to the events that are celebrated on Hanukkah, has an introductory chapter. That's the chapter, a large part of which is quoted here, chapter 1 of Second Maccabees. And the chapter here comes from the Jewish community in the land of Israel to the Jewish community in Egypt, encouraging them to celebrate this holiday. And the encouragement includes, as you can see, a history of the events which are going to be recounted in this book. So if you'll pay attention, I love this, right? It's easy. It is the 25th day of Kislev, 25th of Kislev being the first day of Hanukkah according to the Hebrew calendar. We shall celebrate the purification of the temple, reminiscent of the story that we all know if we've heard the story of Hanukkah. Whoops, I didn't mean to do that. And so we have to notify you that in order that you may celebrate the Feast of Booths and the Feast of the Fire, given when Nehemiah, who built the temple and the altar, offered sacrifices. This goes back to an earlier history. The writers are encouraging the celebration of the events of the Maccabees in the 2nd century before the Common Era, but they connect their events to something actually quite a bit earlier, and that is the celebration of the dedication, the fire given when Nehemiah built the temple and the altar, offered sacrifices. 2 things need to be noticed here. First of all, the celebration on the 25th day of Kislev is said to be, first and foremost, the celebration of the Feast of Booths. Anyone know another name for that feast? Right, it's called Sukkot, right? Sukkot is the Hebrew word for it, the Feast of Booths. It occurs usually in our months of, if it's early September or October, it's in the first of the Hebrew months, and it is to this day a very, very important Jewish holiday. The writers here insist that Hanukkah is meant to be a celebration of the Feast of Booths and a celebration which remembers something that happened centuries earlier. What is that something? You can see, beginning here in verse 19, I'll do it very quickly. For when our fathers were being led captive to Persia, this is centuries before, the pious priests of that time took some of the fire of the altar and secretly hid it in the hollow of a dry cistern somewhere there in Jerusalem, where they took such precautions that the place was unknown to anyone. But then, after many years had passed, when it pleased God, Ezra and Nehemiah, being the leaders of the Jewish community who came back from the Babylonian exile in the 5th century before the Common Era, the pious priests of that time took some of the fire of the altar, sent the descendants of the priests who had hidden the fire to get it, and when they reported to us that they had not found fire, but thick liquid, I presume that fire here means fuel appropriate for the fire as opposed to the thick liquid. When they reported this to us, that they'd found that, he ordered them to dip it out and bring it, and when the materials for the sacrifice were presented, he ordered that this thick liquid, which should not light, be sprinkled on the wood of the altar, and lo and behold, what happened? A miracle, right? It was the miracle of the lights in the temple. The oil, which was not fit to light, lit, and here we've got a record that in a slightly different fashion, the legend we know, those of us who have heard the stories of Hanukkah, the legend we know connected to the events against the Greeks at the time of the Maccabees in the 2nd century BCE is actually an event in a slightly different fashion, which the Maccabees themselves remembered as happening centuries before. The miracle of the lights, in their view, was not a miracle that happened at the time of the Maccabees, but a miracle that happened at the time of the rededication of the temple in the 5th century BCE. Bear this in mind, both the connection to Sukkot, the festival of booths, and this miracle which is recounted here, and you will appreciate what happens with Hanukkah as we go forward. So, next. Everything you will see from now on comes from a text that some of you know, but just to put it in context, all of these quotations are from the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud. This is a very important source for Jewish teaching. Judaism, as we know it today, ultimately goes back more than to any text to this Talmud, and so its teachings are crucial for our understanding the attitudes and values of Judaism. I do want to say two things before we jump in here. Those of you who have learned in the past that Hanukkah is a minor holiday may have heard one of the two following justifications or explanations of that. Number one, that it's not a biblical holiday, as though not being biblical makes something minor. We'll see what the Talmud has to say about that, but I want to observe that much of Judaism as we know it comes from this text, the Talmud, and not from the Bible. So if it were true, and it's not, that something not biblical is therefore less important, then large parts of Judaism as we know it today and for the last many centuries would have to be judged unimportant by the same evaluation, because much of Judaism, as it has been practiced for centuries, goes back not to the Bible, but to rabbinic texts such as the Talmud. That's number one. Number two, if you've heard a little bit more sophisticated a presentation on this, you may have heard that the earliest of the rabbinic texts, a book called the Mishnah, which was finished in about the year 200 of the Common Era, has almost nothing to say about Hanukkah, and therefore the rabbis must have considered it to be unimportant. That also is not a defensible position for one very simple reason. Let's draw a quick parallel. The Mishnah, that same book by the rabbis, has almost nothing to say about the Torah, right? By which I mean the scroll of the Torah. It says almost nothing about the way a Torah scroll should be written, the way it should be laid out on the parchments and so forth. Now I ask you, is the Torah unimportant to Judaism? Obviously not. So that argument doesn't hold any water either. Bear those in mind as we go forward as well. Let's look at this and ask ourselves. This is kind of going to be a sort of pursuing a mystery. What I'd like to try to understand with you is when we look at the directions for the rituals of Hanukkah, what can we glean about the attitudes that the rabbis who were formulating these rituals, what were they trying to teach? What did they think the nature and importance of the day was? So this is the first. The religious duty, the mitzvah, with respect to the lighting of the lamps, begins when the sun sets and continues until pedestrians have left the marketplace. That would mean in a place like New York City during holiday time, how long does it go? Right? It never stops, right? Or something like that. Depending upon where you are in the city, you could go virtually all night. I understand setting something as beginning from sunset, if we think about it. If any of you have been to the Rockefeller Center tree during daytime, right? Unimpressive, right? Unimpressive. You go there when it gets dark, and all of a sudden what happens? Right? It's jaw-dropping. Well, if you start it when it's still light, the Hanukkah lights are not going to be very impressive. So you have to wait till it gets dark, and then it goes until pedestrians have left the marketplace. It's a very unusual way to set the clock for a ritual. What do you think is going on here? What seems to be important to the people who are writing this text? Somebody's got to see it. Exactly right. This has got to be seen. It's got to be very, very public. The criteria, therefore, is make it obvious. The light has to be seen. And how long does it go? Well, as long as people see it, that's how long as it goes. Let's go on. I want to make sure not to, right, I have to keep my own time here, so let me make sure, right. As to the Hanukkah lamp, the religious duty is to leave it at the door of one's house on the outside. If you don't have rights to the outside of the door because you live in New York City on the, say, 12th floor, although that's going to be a problem for other reasons, Then you can put it at the window nearest the public domain, and in a time of danger, and of course Jews have always known times like these, then you could put it on your table and it's enough. And to add to this, as you can see, one rabbi directs that you have to have another lamp to make use of the light of that other lamp for any secular purpose. Now let's be very, very careful here. I want to begin with this term right here, Hanukkah lamp. For those of you who have a little bit of Hebrew, and I know that there's some of my friends here who do, so just to remind you, the term which is used here in the Talmud is ner Hanukkah. We usually translate that as the candle of Hanukkah. Lamp is actually a better translation, but they didn't have candles in the 2nd century or the 3rd century, which is when this text comes from. So what do we mean by a Hanukkah lamp? Anybody know? What's a Hanukkah lamp? Yes, a regular old oil lamp, right? I'm sure that somewhere we've got large collections of oil lamps on display, right? Some fancy and some not so fancy. Well, those normal oil lamps, there would have been no way to distinguish a Hanukkah lamp, right, because it is in no other way distinct, from a normal oil lamp other than what? Well, they begin to lay it out here. What makes a Hanukkah lamp is the fact that what? You use it for a special purpose in certain ways at certain times. If you don't do it in those ways, then it's just a normal lamp. So the burden is to make obvious its Hanukkah connection or its Hanukkah quality. Let's see the way they want to make sure that you do this. Now, first of all, where should you put your Hanukkah lamp since it's a normal oil lamp? Outside the door to your house. For them, houses were rarely houses like ours, where you walk into the front door and you are in the entryway, say. For them, the entryway was more typically going to be what? A courtyard. Right? So when they talk about putting outside the door of one's house, what they intend is you put it outside of the door of the courtyard, literally in the public domain, literally in the public road. Right? Only under special conditions can you put it anywhere else. And you've got to have another lamp to use for normal purposes for one very simple reason. If you use a Hanukkah lamp for normal purposes, then what's the problem? What's to distinguish it from a normal lamp? There's no way to know that it's for Hanukkah and not for something else. Let's go on and see what other kinds of directions they give. Right? Said Rav Kahana. We have an exposition here in the name of Rabbi Tanchum, the Hanukkah candle, that one set a height above 20 cubits is invalid. A cubit is the length of your forearm, right? So it's about 30 feet high. Those of us who live, above, say, I don't know, the 3rd floor of an apartment building, I mean, every time I light my Hanukkah candles, I'm desperately aware of the fact that I have this, all wrong. Why do they want it to be below 20 cubits? Right, because you're not going to be able to see it. It's just too high, right? Unless, of course, it's as big as, again, the Rockefeller Center Christmas tree, in which case it can be very, very high, but that's because of the size and obvious quality of it. And, right, the religious duty is to leave it within a handbreadth nearest the door. What does that add? Anybody have an interpretation? Not only is it obvious to those walking by, it's obvious to everybody walking in and out. And for those of you who know Jewish households and the rituals that attach to Jewish homes, notably, this will be on one side of the door, while the little scroll called the mezuzah is going to be on the other side of the door. And the intention here, quite explicitly, is to frame your door from the outside. For those of you who are familiar with this language, when you walk through the door to your house, you will literally be surrounded with mitzvahs. You will be surrounded with the performance of the commandments. So public, obvious in the broadest way possible. And you're going to see this over and over again. The question we have to ask begin asking ourselves at least, is why is this the importance? Why is it so important that it be public in the most obvious way? To go on. So, religious duty in respect to Hanukkah. There is to be a lamp for each person and his household. I know I just mistranslated. Man here probably means man. For each man and his household. In other words, how many Hanukkah lamps do you need in any given household? Just one, and that means just one oil lamp, not 8, right? That's the minimum. So one for each man in his household. Those who excel, right, have a lamp for each member of the household. So if you have 5 people in your family, you have 5 oil lamps outside your door there in the public thoroughfare. And then they go on and describe this highest level of all. And I do have to comment that Hanukkah is the one occasion in the Jewish calendar when any Jew who observes it at the highest level possible. Right? So now they argue, right? The rabbis, they typically argue, and for those of you who know the rabbinic estate, you know that these 2 rabbis argue a lot. According to Shammai, on the first day you light 8 candles and you go down one night, right? So 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. According to Hillel, you begin with 1 and you go up to 8. What I'd actually like to pay attention to here is not Hillel. Hillel usually wins, which is why we go from 1 to 8, but to Shammai's opinion, because Shammai's opinion here is in its way the more insightful one. As you can see, the Talmud explains both of these opinions. Hillel's is justified by a principle that when we're talking about holy things, we always go up and never go down, therefore 1 to 8. But look at Shammai's explanation. It corresponds to the bulls, right? The sacrifices that were brought at the temple in Jerusalem on the Festival of Tabernacles. Well, lo and behold, that's the second time we've seen mention of tabernacles. What does Shammai know that before we began this afternoon we mostly didn't know? What does he know? That this holiday is meant to be the celebration of the Festival of Booths, right? Hanukkah is meant to be the celebration of the Festival of Booths. Why that's true, I will go on to explain, but that is the key at the foundation for understanding the way Hanukkah was understood, not only at its beginning, but through the subsequent centuries. Okay? Now, what this is referring to is the fact that if you look at the Torah, at the foundation of Jewish practice, that on the holiday of Sukkot, on this Feast of Tabernacles, which was the greatest of the pilgrimage festivals at the temple in Jerusalem. In fact, it was known in ancient times simply as, some of you will recognize this term, the Hajj. Okay, now I know many of you probably think that I should be pronouncing that as Hag, right? But in fact, in the pronunciation of those days, before we got it a little bit wrong, they would have pronounced in just the same way as we expect it to be pronounced in Arabic. This pilgrimage festival was called in Hebrew as the Hajj. Right? So you went once a year, if you went at all, during this festival, because the season of gathering in the crops is over. You can go and you can party and enjoy and thank God for the abundance you've gotten. And this is what Hanukkah is meant to be. But there was one problem, and this comes back to the history of it. The problem during the year that the Maccabees reconquered the temple and sought to rededicate it is that in the month of the holiday, what was still true? The temple was controlled by the Greeks. And so they couldn't celebrate the festival at the appropriate time. What did they do, therefore? When Jerusalem was conquered, when the temple was reconquered and rededicated, recognizing how important this festival is in the Jewish calendar, they celebrated the holiday of Tabernacles, not in its appointed month, the month of Tishrei, but in the month of Kislev, at this time of year, that is. Right? And what this explains is why Hanukkah originally, even before the rabbis reinvented the legend, Hanukkah from its origins was 8 days. Why? Because the only biblical holiday which lasts for 8 days is the festival of Sukkot, Tabernacles. Already in the Torah, it goes on for 8 days, and that is at the source of the 8 days of Hanukkah. So this connection is the key connection. We're going to have to say more about that as we go on. Now, this is the story that, if you've heard any story at all about Hanukkah, I suspect is the familiar one to you. So let's look at the way it's repeated in its own words in the Talmud. So on the 25th day of the Kislev, or the days of Hanukkah, 8, and on these days it's forbidden to lament. This is meant to be a joyous time, and now comes the explanation. When the Greeks entered the sanctuary, they made all of the oil that was in the sanctuary unclean. But when the rule of the Hasmonean house took hold and they conquered them, they searched but found only a single jar of oil. Going back to the oil miracle, here transformed from the way we saw it in 2 Maccabees, right, lying with the seal of the high priest, had only enough for a single day. It went on for 8 days, and this is why it is celebrated for 8 days according to this. But it's actually very interesting the way this is expressed if you look at it carefully. A miracle was done with it. We'll come back to that. And they lit the lamp with it for 8 days, miraculously replicating exactly the length of time of Sukkot, the Festival of Tabernacles. And they made them festival days. Festival, right? Chag is the same word, right? And this celebration for the recitation of Hallel Psalms. For those of you who know Jewish practice, this is also an important key. There are only a few times during the year that what are called the Hallel Psalms are recited in full. And the only 2 occasions when those psalms are recited in full from beginning to end are the holiday of Sukkot, the holiday of Tabernacles, and now you will easily fill in the blank, and the holiday of Hanukkah. Those 2 occasions alone. The fact that they're recited in full on Hanukkah is also meant to be a claim that what we are observing now is the same holiday and is meant to be every bit as important. Let's see the way this is spelled out. Okay, so first of all, this is the Talmud's response to the argument you so often hear about Hanukkah being a non-biblical festival, therefore it can't be terribly important. The discussion, as you can see, is a discussion of the blessings that one is supposed to recite over the candles. So, right over here, right, Rab Judah, first day one who lights it, says 3, and then that from there on 2, and the one who sees it says 1 less for each of these. A discussion of which one is left out, right, on the subsequent days, the days after the first. Interestingly, you leave out the one which says, thank God I made it to this time of year once again over the course of the calendar cycle. But then the Talmud asks, why not leave out the blessing over the miracle? Right? Why do you choose to leave out one and not the other? The answer is, the miracle was every day. And so the rabbis here tell us, in their words explicitly, the point of this occasion is what? To celebrate a miracle. Now, we'd have to ask what the miracle is. We know their story of the oil and so forth, but I would submit that it actually goes beyond that. The crucial thing here is the centrality of the miracle, but now look at the way this goes. So what blessing do you say? And look carefully at the wording of those of you who know Jewish practice will be familiar with the fact that all blessings begin in more or less the same way. Blessings for the performance of these rituals have a very precise formulaic beginning, right? Blessed be you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has sanctified us by his commandments and commanded us to light the Hanukkah light. Those of you who are celebrating Hanukkah will have already recited that blessing this year. The Talmud asks the obvious question. That question is, where did God command us to light the Hanukkah lights? What's the problem with the wording of that blessing? If God commanded us, we should be able to find it where? In Scripture. Right? But if you can't find it in Scripture, how would you know if God commanded you? If it's only a post-biblical holiday, where in the world or how in the world would God command it? Now, the rabbis play a game here. This is a typical rabbinic game, but it's actually a very serious game. They say it derives from the verse, quote, you shall not turn aside. The rabbis know that there's a verse in Deuteronomy which declares that we are always supposed to follow the teachers and judges in our own day. So the Torah in this reading supports what the sages do. If the sages say observe Hanukkah, then in effect what that means is that God commanded us to observe Hanukkah. Yeah, it's a little bit of a stretch, but it's a stretch we have to take seriously because what they are doing is responding to that little piece of suspicion we might have when we say, but wait a second, this is not a biblical holiday, maybe it's not so important. And their response to that claim is what? It is a biblical holiday. Not in the way we ordinarily mean that, but it has the status of divine command because when the people celebrates what they consider to be a miracle, and that celebration is agreed upon by the leaders of the people in any given generation, that takes on itself the authority of divine command. That is how important, says this text. And when we recite the blessing, we actually are echoing the insistence of this text. That is how important this holiday is. Forget about the no biblical holiday argument. As far as they're concerned, it doesn't hold. Now, here you see something. This is a very technical legal text. But I offer it to you because of two things. Number one, it is one of only two occasions that in the entire earlier text of the rabbis, that is to say the Mishnah, that's what that M down there at the end means, it's one of only a couple of occasions where the holiday is mentioned in that earliest rabbinic text, but it also tells us how, legally speaking, the rabbis thought of the importance of the observance of Hanukkah. So let's see the way it works. A camel which was carrying flax and passed by the public way. All you have to do is imagine any old city in any old Arab land at this point. Think of the old city of Jerusalem, and you'll have a perfect picture of this. So the streets are how wide? Right, very, very narrow. And the stores, right, not behind closed doors, but open out onto the public thoroughfare. That's the way the merchants will sell their goods. So, if you've got a camel walking along one of those very, very narrow streets, and it's got flax on its back, it's walking on the public way, and the flax was loaded onto the camel's back in a careless way, as a consequence of which part of it went in to one of the storefronts, where there was, of course, a fire lit in order to light the storefront, because we all know how important store lights are, right? And set fire to the building as a result. Under those circumstances, the owner of the camel is liable. Why? Why? We've got to have a lawyer or two here, right? Former lawyer. Why is the owner of the camel liable? Right? Because he was careless. Exactly right. He was negligent. You shouldn't be walking along with poorly loaded camels in such a way that it might be the source of a fire in the marketplace. If, on the other hand, the storekeeper had set his lamp outside, then obviously that changes the burden of the law altogether, because under these circumstances, who's the one who's being careless? Right? The storekeeper, for putting the lamps outside. And therefore, under those circumstances, the storekeeper will be liable. But now look what happens on Hanukkah. Rabbi Judah says, in the case of a candle lit for Hanukkah, which is put where? Where does it have to be put again? Outside in the public thoroughfare. Under those circumstances, the shopkeeper is exempt under all circumstances. Now, those of you who know anything about the rabbis know that they take law very, very seriously. They probably spend more time paying attention to the fine points of law than to anything else. If they're going to make an expression of value, it's going to be in the way they work with the law. And what this law work tells us is that when it comes to bringing the candles of Hanukkah outside, making this as public as possible of an observance, right, under those circumstances, it's so important that what? That the law of damages changes altogether. Whereas every single day of the year otherwise, it would be the one who brings the fire outside who would be liable. The storekeeper in this case, when it comes to Hanukkah, the camel driver needs to know that there's going to be a lot of fire out there, and therefore it is the camel driver, or anybody else for that matter, who's got to take precaution. What this reversal shows us is how very and deeply important Hanukkah is in the minds of the rabbis. They're even willing to shift completely the laws of damages over it. Now, this leads to, let me go back. This leads to a rabbinic puzzle. Okay, so I want to ask you all to participate in the rabbinic puzzle. We're going to see two answers, and then there's going to be the third part of the puzzle, and I want you to provide the answers to that third part. Those of you who were with me last night in the class I was teaching, you may not open your mouths during this part of the discussion. Okay? So, said Rabbah, it is clear to me that if someone can't afford both of the things about to be mentioned, and has to choose between a lamp for his house and a lamp for Hanukkah. Lamp for his house and a lamp for Hanukkah, they're probably not talking about the lamps themselves, but talking about the oil needed to light the lamps. Right? So talking about someone who's poor, they can afford, again, this is the probable discussion, the oil for one lamp or the oil for the other. And the discussion is the lamp for his house, to light the house, and the lamp for Hanukkah. Under those circumstances, the lamp for his house takes precedence. Why? for the welfare of the household. The Hebrew here is actually quite beautiful and known, it will be at least to some of you. The Hebrew is shalom bayit, literally for the peace of the household. Right? In order to be peaceful in your household, in order to avoid injury, quite literally, you have to be sure that there's light in the house at night. So where there is danger of the household being harmed, that takes precedence. Shalom bayit over the Hanukkah lamp. Right? The lamp for it takes precedence. If he has to choose between a lamp for his house and wine for saying the prayer for the sanctification of the holy day, that is a very long, wordy translation of a very short Hebrew phrase, right? The wine for kiddush. Some of you will know that. That's the special ritual over wine recited at the beginning of the Sabbath and festivals. So if the choice is between buying the oil to light your house and buying the wine to say that prayer at the beginning of the Sabbath, for example, then what comes first? For the same reason, lamp for his house, for the welfare of the household. Now, based upon that, we've got a question. If one has to choose between buying a lamp for Hanukkah and wine for saying the prayer of sanctification of the holy day, what is the rule? Now, everyone got this? You've got the Sabbath wine and you've got the oil for Hanukkah. Which one comes first? Now, before I began this afternoon, pretend you haven't heard anything. Right? Only pretend. If you've literally not heard something, then don't let me know. But pretend you haven't heard anything from the very beginning. If someone were to have asked you this question, which is more important? If you have your choice between one or the other, the wine to say the blessing at the beginning of the Sabbath, or the oil for Hanukkah, say Hanukkah candles, which should take precedence? You would have answered what? Obviously wine for Sabbath. Why? Right? Because A, it happens every week, right? But it happens every week because why? It is a biblical festival, right? And it is recognized as being crucially important in the kind of cycle of Jewish life. Arguably, the Sabbath is the most important holiday that we have. There are a lot of arguments to that effect. But that's the question. You would have answered it that way. They ask it as a question. Should the sanctification of the day take precedence because it's permanent and recurrent? We would add because it's biblical, right? Or perhaps the lamp for Hanukkah should take precedence because, and now we have, at least in their words, a new concept, because it thereby publicizes the miracle. Okay? I can turn the page in a minute. Right? Unfortunately, given the context of this presentation, you probably know how to guess the answer. Right? What's the answer going to be? Right? Yes. The way it's expressed is actually very interesting. After he raised the question, he concluded, the word that's translated here, concluded, is actually the word for obvious. He concluded that the answer is obvious. That is, the lamp for Hanukkah should take precedence because it thereby publicizes the miracle. Okay? This is the obligation. How we understand the miracle is open to our interpretation. Note that the book of Maccabees itself has one understanding of the miracle. The rabbis have a slightly different version of the miracle. But what they agree on is that the occasion for the reconquest of the space where the temple was, the rededication of the temple and its service, right? All of that is so important. Well, actually, before I get to importance, all of that is a miracle. There's no other way to read it. Moreover, if you rededicate a temple, and this is an important piece of the background as well, you've got to rededicate it on the holiday of Sukkot, on the holiday of Tabernacles. Why? The Maccabees understood this very, very well. Because the first temple at the time of Solomon was dedicated, you can fill this in by guessing very quickly, the first temple at the time of Solomon was dedicated when? Right, at the time of Sukkot. The second temple, at the time of Nehemiah and Ezra, which we saw a reference to before, was dedicated when? At the time of Sukkot. That's very explicit in those books. And so Hanukkah is meant to be a festival celebrating the temple. It is a temple holiday that you knew, but the centrality of that now emerges in a relief that it did not have before. And that's why on the time of Hanukkah, what we're actually doing is celebrating the Jewish festival, the biblical festival of tabernacles. This is when the dedications of temples, that is to say the Jerusalem temple, and any miracle done in that connection has to be celebrated. Just one footnote here, and then I'm going to go on. I've got a punchline here, and then I'll be happy to take a question or two. But before I get to the punchline, this if we consider all of this as background, you will also be able to understand in a slightly different way what has motivated the medieval European galleries at the Met to show images on manuscripts in recent years that represent not the menorah in the way we often use that term as a synonym for the Hanukkah lamp, because that is actually not the correct term for the Hanukkah lamp. And if someone's been overly clever with you, you may have heard at some time in the past, oh, what we use on Hanukkah isn't actually a menorah, because a menorah is 6 plus 1, and a Chanukiah is 8 plus 1. I'm talking about the numbers of the arms that come from it, and they're actually two very different symbols. Well, Ecclesiastes gives advice, don't be overly smart. Right? Don't be overly smart, because in fact the menorah in the literal proper sense is as relevant to Hanukkah as we can imagine, for one very simple reason. The menorah is the symbol of the temple for ancient Jews more than anything else. And if you go throughout the land of Israel to archaeological sites, wherever there are visual remains, and this is particularly true in burial sites and ancient synagogues, you will find that inevitably they have got on their walls or on their floors an image of the temple menorah. Why? Because they all hoped that after the destruction of the second temple, the temple would be rebuilt and rededicated again. It is that same symbol which is then celebrated in connection to Hanukkah. So, two questions. If someone were to ask you, how should Hanukkah be celebrated? The simple answer is, as loudly and publicly as possible. How you feel about that is another matter, right? As publicly as possible. And why is that the answer? Because when we ask ourselves about the importance of this festival, in the views at least of the post-biblical tradition, beginning with Maccabees and then through the rabbis, if we ask them, how important is this holiday? Their response to us would be what? As important as you can imagine. It even takes precedence in its observance over the Sabbath in certain very distinct ways. And the punchline, to prove its importance, all you need to do is see this, right? Said Rav Huna, he who makes a practice of lighting the lamp, meeting on Hanukkah, will have sons who are disciples of sages, right? There are two things being said here, right? If you celebrate Hanukkah properly, you'll have sons, and given their prejudice, right, you know how important, therefore, this is, right? If something leads to the birth of sons, you know it's got to be pretty darn important, and those sons will not only be male and not female, they will also be disciples of sages, and given rabbinic prejudice, the best kind of child you can imagine having is the child who is male and the disciple of sages. And if you needed anything more explicit to describe the importance of Hanukkah, this is it. So Hanukkah, a minor occasion? Not so much. A higher holiday is what I think these texts show very, very clearly. I'm open to questions for a few minutes. Yes. Yes. So your question is, did the rabbis of the Talmud know the story that goes back to Maccabees? Was that the question? Yes. We have no way of knowing that. Whether they did or didn't, they never quoted, they never referred to it. It doesn't mean that they necessarily didn't know it. They could have told the legend in different ways, even if they knew the version in Maccabees. The crucial thing is that for the rabbis, Maccabees, while a part of Jewish history, was not a part of the sacred history. Right? We learned that from the fact that it was excluded from the Hebrew Bible, and so obviously they went in their own direction. The fact that they exclude the books of Maccabees, though, from the Hebrew Bible is not because, again, coming back to the old argument, if they thought that Hanukkah were so important, they would have made these books part of the Hebrew Bible. There happens to be a rabbinic rule or a rule from the Jewish world of that period with respect to the question of what makes it into the Jewish Bible and what doesn't. It's a very simple rule. If a book has obviously been written later than the Persian period, that is to say, before the conquests of the Greeks, it just won't be considered for inclusion in the Hebrew Bible. And so it's not meant as any kind of statement about the importance of the events described when the books are not included in the Hebrew Bible. Yes? Could I discuss Hanukkah versus Hanukkah? Oh, how to pronounce it? Oh, you mean the way we had up there, right? Hanukkah, Hanukkah. Yeah, yes, I understand. Yes, I can comment on that. Okay, I do understand what you're saying. Let me explain very, very quickly. I was pronouncing it in the way I learned to pronounce it when I grew up in the nearby New Jersey suburbs and went to Hebrew school. Right? There was nothing any more sophisticated about my pronunciation than that. It's just the only way I've ever pronounced it. But I do want to comment on this. In Hebrew, as we mostly in this sentence means except for Jews from Arab lands. Okay, I'm being very careful in this. We mostly think of the letter at the beginning of the word Hanukkah, chet, in the pronunciation that I just used. It's a relatively hard chet, and if people did not grow up with that pronunciation, they usually have a hard time actually learning it in more advanced years, anything over age 11 or 12, say. But in fact, the more correct pronunciation of that letter at the beginning, the chet, is closer to a slightly aspirated Arabic equivalent. It's harder than a simple H, but far less hard, far less cha than the way we often hear it. And therefore, if you barely heard me saying it, I would have been pronouncing it more correctly than if I pronounced it with a hard guttural. Yes. Yes, please. There are many, many things we could do with Hanukkah. I obviously had something very specific in mind in terms of arguing for its historical importance. The fact that, to just take the interpretation that you mentioned, the fact that it has been used in those directions shows how important it continued to be in the different directions of Jewish tradition. And I would only remark, by taking your comment and bringing it back, it is quite the case that Hanukkah has what we would call messianic implications, even though at the time that Hanukkah was first observed, or at the time of the events, the image or the character of Messiah, as we know it, had not yet fully developed. This is something that was developing at precisely this time. But it's quite clear that in our meaning of the word, Hanukkah has messianic implications because, of course, restoration means restoration to Jerusalem, rebuilding of the temple, and so forth. And it is fair to say that the first time in Jewish history that restoration did not mean that is in quite recent centuries. Others, yes? I assume everything is symbolic, right? To begin that, we would need, at least another lecture. There is a lot to be said about that. Are we talking about the tree of life? In which case, how are we to understand the precise number and so forth? The only thing that, important to what we've seen here is that the image which comes to be taken in later centuries by the Hanukkah lamp is not original to the observance of Hanukkah. And this actually makes a very important point. This is something that I often like to teach, and since you asked the question, I find the opportunity to share it. We often think of things as being specially dedicated to holy purposes, or even some of us may believe that certain things or certain places are essentially sacred, like a Torah scroll or a Quran or a Christian Bible. There are such beliefs, obviously. What Hanukkah does is to say you can take something quite common and through its use render it not only uncommon but sacred. Right? Now, for me, that is a very, very important lesson. Because if all we can do is dedicate things to the sacred, then there are large parts of life that actually don't enter into the realm of the sacred. One of the important lessons of Hanukkah, and by the way, Sukkot shares in this as well, because in the ancient world, everybody throughout the summer used booths, right? Because you would die if you didn't protect yourself from the sun, right, with those booths. And the rabbis actually comment that Jews are observing the commandment in a silly way because we go into the booths when everyone else at the end of the harvest season is leaving them, right? And so Sukkot, too, takes a common object in the ancient world, the sukkah, and renders it special. Hanukkah, more than any other holiday, makes this symbolic point, since we talk about symbolism, that we can take that which is perfectly common and through special use, right, for certain periods of time, make it sacred. To me, that argues that all parts of our life can also be, with special dedication, made sacred, even though in other ways they're perfectly common. Thank you. It's been a pleasure being here. And I wish you a good holiday, whatever your holiday may be.